Hello and welcome to Dialogue Gospel Study. This week we're pleased to share videos of friends of Dialogue reflecting and sharing insights on Doctrine and Covenants section 132 and the topic of polygamy. We hope that you'll enjoy hearing from them. We'd also like to invite you to go to dialoguejournal.com, click on issues and articles, browse by topic, and go and check out what we have there under polygamy. You can see a lot of the great work that the journal has published in its more than 55 years on this important topic. We've got Blair Osler on queer polygamy, Stephen Carter, Scared Sacred, How the Horrifying Story of Joseph Smith's Polygamy Can Help Save Us, Christopher Blythe, The Highest Class of Adulterers and Whoremongers, Plural Marriage, The Church of Jesus Christ, and the Construction of Marriage. Marian Watson's work on Short Creek, A Refuge for the Saints, D. Michael Quinn, Plural Marriage and Mormon Fundamentalism. We've got work by Ken Driggs and Leo Lyman, Carmen Hardy, Martha Bradley. We've got Eugene England on Fidelity, Polygamy, and Celestial Marriage, work by Richard Van Wagner, and Jesse Embry, including Mothers and Daughters in Polygamy. We hope that you'll head to the website and use some of these past publications as you think about this topic again.
So I've spent a number of years in my career working with Title IX cases, sexual assault cases. And something I learned during that time period is to listen and trust both sides and realize that a lot of situations are very, very complicated, especially understanding people's perceptions, maybe versus reality. This is kind of the approach that I bring with understanding polygamy. I listen and I trust what people were feeling and expressing is valid and very complicated. It's hard to put together a whole story from somebody's written narrative, diary, public proclamations, and so forth. And polygamy had to have been extremely complicated feeling-wise to live. I believe the women, when they spoke of receiving spiritual witnesses and confirmation that what they were doing was correct. I definitely believe them when they compared their experience to Abrahamic sacrifice, that just as Abraham sacrificed what was nearest and dearest to him, Isaac, they were sacrificing relationships, family structures, experiences, hopes and dreams on an altar for something they felt and they believed to be bigger and better. That was a sacrifice for them. I believe them when they publicly advocated for it, that what they were doing was God's will and what they felt was the right thing to do. I also believe them when they expressed pain, when there was jealousy, when there was feelings of rejection, neglect, when they felt alone, when they felt isolated and hurt. I believe that polygamy ripped hearts out many times for them. I also believe them when they would have doubts and struggle with those prior witnesses that they had, understanding if what they were doing was really right, was really God's will. I also believe them when they expressed frustrations with spouse, with sister wives. I believe it was a very difficult situation and it wasn't the same for every woman. It's easy for us to look back and to make pronouncements, judgment calls, to call one side good, one side bad, or this experience good and this experience bad. I know for those in that situation, it was much more complicated. I believe that when a practice like polygamy is intertwined so tightly with ideas of exaltation, theology, and family, that it was impossible for them to separate their exaltation from their experience in polygamy. I also am fully aware that free will is different and varies, and women exercising agency has been complicated. And that for a woman to exercise agency back there in regards to polygamy was not the same as women exercising agency today in regards to relationships. When you're proposed to by your church leader, and this marriage proposal is based on your temporal and spiritual salvation, how much agency do you really have? And of course, when you make that limited choice to be able to live with it, you're going to back it up and you're going to validate it in any way you can to make things livable and meaningful for you. This is why it's so complicated, and it's so easy for us to see black and white, see nuance now, but living in the thick of it, living through the moments of wanting to do the right thing and realizing that sometimes the right thing is the hard thing, but then also what was the right thing. And if it is a situation where somebody is not in a healthy family relationship, was that the right thing? It's impossible for an egalitarian equal partnership to exist in a polygamous relationship. There's no way that couples can actually act as true partners and companions when the power dynamic is such that you have one man and multiple women, and those women are competing for the time, attention, and competing to be the one by the side of the man. It doesn't exist. And this is where, we can see dynamics where sometimes sister wives are more like daughters to the more senior wife, or there's competition between the women, or the older wives felt rejected and thrown aside as younger wives come into the scene. It's extremely complicated. And what I ultimately believe is that women did the best with what they were given in the circumstance. And it was a very hard circumstance. And I'm very grateful that it's not a circumstance or a life that I have to live, a choice I have to make, a theology I have to defend and justify. It's not my experience, but I respect the women for doing the best they could with what they have, with the limited agency, with the limited understanding, and then with the knowledge that they possess. And I trust that they possessed, and that I trust that they felt they were doing the best things they could for themselves and their family. It's a painful topic for me, but when I'm frustrated, I always go back to the women and their stories. And I find comfort watching them navigate a difficult situation, doing the best they could with what they were given. And I love them, and I'm grateful for them for that.
When Sarah Clausen became Hans Peter Jensen's second wife, she remembered that she initially had no desire to marry, as she wrote in her autobiography, archived at the Church History Library. Sarah Clausen was relatively new to her faith, having left Lutheranism and been baptized just a few years earlier. She and Jensen met at a church conference in Hamburg, Germany, but there wasn't much for them to talk about. Not only was there an age gap, she was 20 and he 33, but she only spoke Danish and he only spoke German. They had no common language. Yet Sarah Clausen's local church president had written a glowing, quote, letter recommending Hans Peter as a true and faithful man who had been a zealous missionary, end quote, and, so the president thought, he would make a good husband. Perhaps Clausen also felt lonesome or practical. She had been on her own ever since her baptism, her parents having taken her conversion badly and barred her from their household. Marrying Jensen could give her a home again. She considered it in silence for a while, and after giving Jensen's marriage proposal thought and prayer, Clausen resolved to, quote, look upon the situation as a mission, end quote, a mission of her own. She eventually accepted his proposal, and when she visited her family with her new fiancé in tow, they were so shocked that they stopped giving her the cold shoulder. Sure, they were upset that she had gone and become a Baptist, but they didn't want her to go and marry a widower without them even knowing. Ah, that's right. Clausen was Jensen's second wife, but his first, Anna Marie, was dead, and they were not getting sealed in a temple or an endowment house. No, they were simply Baptists who asked a local preacher to wed them. It was 1849, and Sarah Clausen and her future husband were still a whole year away from meeting an American missionary and joining the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. 2 years after that was when they first learned about polygamy. Forgive my cheeky twist at the end there, but I find so interesting how easily I, and perhaps you as well, detected tropes often associated with polygamy where there was no polygamy to detect. Second wife, age gap, marriage as a non-romantic duty. In the 19th century Western world, women considering marriage faced all sorts of difficult, unexpected, and sometimes even unpleasant decisions, whether that marriage was monogamous or polygamous. I dwell on Sarah Clausen Jensen's story so much here because her life did later intersect more directly with Doctrine and Covenants section 132. By 1850, Sarah had learned German, necessary for communicating with her husband Hans Peter and the 4 children he'd had with Anna Marie. And Sarah was so adept at the language that while living in Copenhagen, she was asked to translate the revelation on celestial marriage, as she called it, from German into Danish. It was, she wrote, quote, "the first I had ever heard or seen of this doctrine. I must say that I was thunderstruck. It was so contrary to my feeling and tradition that I stopped," end quote. Just like the last time she was faced with unexpected ideas about marriage, when Hans Peter proposed to her 3 years earlier, so too in 1852 did Sarah find herself pausing. And then, again, as with Hans Peter's proposal, Sarah turned to prayer for answers about strange ideas regarding marriage. Quote, "After a severe struggle with weeping and praying, I saw some light, and the Lord spake peace to my soul, and I had a testimony of the divinity of this revelation, and by the help of God I felt willing to make this great sacrifice," end quote. Make that sacrifice she evidently did. After they migrated to Utah, Hans Peter married 3 more times before his death in 1883. I tell you Sarah Clausen Jensen's story, at least part of the way she told it, in part because I wanted to sit with the perspective of a woman to whom Section 132 mattered. By authorizing polygamy, Section 132 shaped 33 years of Clausen's married life. If not for it, while she would have still been Hans Peter Jensen's second wife, she would have remained his only living wife. I wanted to sit, I suppose, with the struggle of piecing together how Section 132 and plural marriage shaped women like Sarah. Her brief autobiography is preserved, but she focuses on narrating events and offers limited interpretation. She tells so much about what happened, and relatively little about how she felt. We don't know precisely what the peace was that she felt God speak to her soul. We don't know how polygamy and monogamy compared for her, or if unromantically marrying Hans Peter was basically the same with any number of wives. We don't know what she thought about being a stepmother to his first 4 children, or what it was like having first a blended family and later a plural family. And I wanted to sit with how we don't know that for thousands of women. Every plural wife, first, second, or 30th, had her reasons, whether she wrote them or told them or not. Some have told us in great deal their reasons. Plenty haven't. I suppose what I mean to say is that for all that I love the knowledge that historians make possible, speaking as one, I also know we're never left with all the pieces to the puzzle. Some knowledge might always remain mysterious to the reader. Simultaneously, I wanted to sit with the perspective of a woman who herself mattered to Section 132. By translating the revelation on celestial marriage, as she called it, Clausen shaped part of its history of reception and translation. If not for her, Danish language Latter-day Saints would have had to wait for someone else's translation. She played a role in internationalizing plural marriage as well as eternal marriage. Since 1852, there have, of course, been new translations of the Doctrine and Covenants into Danish, nowadays directly from English rather than via a secondary language like German. But at least for a time, and at least in some places, reading Section 132 has meant reading words a woman chose. Chosen to represent what a man dictated, sure, but chosen by a woman nonetheless. In 2025, when thinking about plural marriage and the history of Section 132, Latter-day Saints readily remember men like Joseph Smith who dictated it, Hiram Smith who requested it, William Clayton who scribed it. Sometimes the Saints remember women like Emma Smith who hated it. But I wonder what one might learn by also remembering a woman like Sarah Clausen Jensen, who translated this document that eventually became scripture, and who eventually transformed her life in its image. The history of Section 132 in Nauvoo is dramatic and tempestuous, filled with turmoil and conflict, and it's certainly fascinating. But it can tell only so much about the section itself, and it can't tell that much about its wider legacy. The history of Section 132 with Sarah in Copenhagen tells us something too. Something quiet but complex, understated but upending, reminiscent but radical, something potentializing and pressurizing, all at the same time. Something about a woman with 4 stepchildren, 3 baptisms, 2 languages, and 1 husband with a dead wife. It's something harder to hear, but worth hearing too.
One thing that comes to mind is, as a teenager growing up in the LDS church, we were learning about eternal families in Sunday school and young women's pretty early on. And at a time where a lot of us were starting to get romantic feelings for the first time or express them for the first time, it felt overwhelming to even have feelings for one person, let alone really, talk about polygamy. But in Sunday school, that's what we were learning about was eternal families and the doctrine of polygamy, sometimes at the same time, except something that would happen in the congregations that I grew up going to is that a lot of the young women's leaders or women Sunday school teachers were very uncomfortable teaching this lesson, and especially D&C 132. And sometimes it would be a member of the bishopric or someone's husband, like Ken. He's just Ken. Do you get it? Just some guy would be sitting there explaining to us, and the women would be completely silent. And I think about that silence a lot, and how silence communicates a lot of things, right? Heaviness, discomfort, and maybe also a lot of times resistance. But I remember one time during that lesson, maybe my big gay heart was showing itself long before I had language or awareness of it. But I remember, one of my first reactions to learning about D&C 132 and that revelation and polygamy was me raising my hand and being maybe a little too enthusiastic, like, hey, so when all the husbands and wives go to the celestial kingdom, like, will the women be married to each other too? Or like, it wasn't even about like the idea about them getting to have sex. I truly, what I little I knew about relationships and love and intimacy and marriage was like, well, obviously they're all going to have sex with each other and make one big family together, right? Um, and so obviously, to any of you listening who grew up going to Sunday school, I'm sure you can imagine me asking something like that. The room went dead silent. And let's just say I got into a lot of trouble for that question. And and looking back, I realized something that maybe the adults didn't, which is, that question actually came from a place of faith and curiosity, and maybe also like this kind of instinct that love and eternity should and could be abundant, infinite, mutual, and inclusive, but not necessarily monogamously exclusive, right? And so, even as a child, I think I was kind of pondering these contradictions. Like, if heaven was about this love and abundance, should it not be shaped by hierarchy? And then years later, as I found myself in a very different room at a cafe during the summer in Utah, reuniting with friends, many of whom, had come out of the closet and or, described themselves as post or ex-Mormons, or people who were still in and kind of like trying to figure out and reconcile their beliefs. And a lot, of course, as is common in any LDS or post LDS subculture, dating and romance came up. And, some of my friends were talking about what they jokingly called the Mormon polygamy to polyamory pipeline. And so that kind of came from in Utah and then Arizona, where I was living. We had noticed a number of people who had left the church or maybe weren't traditionally practicing anymore, who were exploring non-monogamy and polyamory, even though, that was not what was the teaching of Mormonism. And sometimes, this debate, not a like judgmental debate, but a debate had come up of like, why was this happening? What was this like social phenomenon that we were kind of seeing unfold in front of us? And we, very friendly debated, like, was the real problem actually non-monogamy itself, or who sanctions it, whether it happens in or outside of marriage? And then, was it the idea of polyamory, where women or, all genders, people who don't identify as man or woman, could all finally benefit from a polyamorous relationship, right? Which was such the opposite of the what seems to be this correlative rigidity of LDS polygamy, right? When you brought in choice agency, and then we're inclusive with the genders of who was doing this type of love and family structure, like, is that what made it wrong? And why were we also drawn to it, even, far, in some ways, far distanced from the faith of our upbringing? So these were some of the thoughts I've had, rereading D&C 132 now, and it's been a few years. And so, these conversations kind of cracked something open I've been circling for a while, which is the idea that Mormon polygamy, even in its patriarchal form, was already queer. And then, queerness was at least buried inside it. And, many folks, including Blair Ostler and Taylor Petrie, have talked about Mormonism as a queer religion, right? And that queerness has always been a part of who we are as a community, but we've now been kind of vesseled into this, violently but normalized heterosexual structure. And, as a missionary, when I would try to teach about D&C 132, it was often used as a justification, at least at that time in the early 2010s, that the one man, many wives, polygamy lifestyle was essential to the time of the church for it to grow spiritually and physically. But also, we tried to lay out these teachings as a vision of eternal sealing and eternal relationships that would transcend death forever, which is really the point of the message. And thinking about queer readings of D&C 132, there is space to reclaim this message about eternal love and connection. And that can be more freeing than thinking about it in the framework of male dominance. And then, the other queer interpretations of this in academics and, friend circles has been that if eternal love is divine and its creation is truly infinite, then we can't limit it to heterosexual monogamy. Right. And then again, you have all these different sociocultural conflicts that come up from this queer theology. And I think the issue here is too, in that is that traditional LDS doctrine has really narrowed down an infinity down to a single shape or a single situation, which is one man, one woman, sealed forever. And for the brief time in polygamy, it was one man, many women, sealed forever. And neither one of those models really fits a queer person or a queer love, which doesn't mean to be just it's two people who are gay. Queer love can look many ways. And that teaching that queer people inherently, we haven't belonged and we're not even envisioned in this model, it can feel like an eternal rejection. That our loves, our families, our futurisms are really just inherently incompatible with heaven. But something else I see in the text, especially in the ending in verse 66, where God promises, I will reveal more to you hereafter. Now looking back, I really see this as an open door, right? For continuing revelation. And I think for a lot of queer people in the church or who've left the church or who are adjacent to the church, we are still hoping and praying that continuing revelation means that ideas about love and family and eternity are still something that can be written. And I think we are writing that. We don't really need heterosexual leaders necessarily to write that for us. I mean, our existence is us writing it. So when I look back on the little kid, me, child me, who got in trouble for asking if the celestial wives would also love and be intimate with each other. I felt embarrassed in the moment, but I wish I could go grab that version of me by the shoulders and say, hey, you should feel proud that you're already someone who believed heaven and love and relationship should be full of connection and not competition, and that there is vast capabilities and ways to love that are not just about procreating and not just about obedience. I really think that a lot of these conversations I've had throughout my life, adjacent to eternal families and then also polygamy, is really trying to find something more within that echoes true inside of me, that we as human beings, including in the church, we ache for love that is expansive, that is communal, and that is chosen. And so maybe in that standpoint, queerness in Mormonism, as other scholars have argued, isn't a contradiction, but a truth that the modern tradition just hasn't fully embraced yet. And that is that eternal love, even the understandings we have of it, they're so limited. Those views and capacities are just so vast that we can't really fit them into a single form. And that heaven, if it does exist, it needs to be a place where all kinds of love and family structures, queer, monogamous, single parent, polyamorous, chosen family, or blood, these types of loves are not just allowed in my gay LDS heaven, but they're also exalted.
So today I want to talk about Section 132 in historical and theological context. First, in the context of LDS canon, because when you look at 132 compared to previous canon that mention polygamy in any way, we've got 1829 Book of Mormon, Jacob 2, which basically forbids polygamy, saying that David and Solomon had many wives and concubines, but this was abominable before God. So God won't suffer people to do like them of old, and unless he wants to raise up seed, and then I will command my people, otherwise they shall not hearken unto these things. So that's pretty clear. And then 1835, Doctrine and Covenants, Section 101, again, repudiates any practice of polygamy. It says, inasmuch as the Church of Christ has been reproached with the crime of fornication and polygamy, we declare that we believe that one man should have one wife and one woman, but one husband, except in the case of death when either is liberty to marry again. So again, that's, very much rejecting the concept. So then we go to 1843 with 132, but 132 is a private revelation. It's not canon. There are copies that are made, and it's cited by others, but it's not canonized. And in 1844, the Doctrine and Covenants that was published just after Joseph Smith's death still had Section 101 in it, repudiating polygamy. So it remained in the Doctrine and Covenants in all subsequent printings until 1876, when a new version of the Doctrine and Covenants was created. So there was nothing on polygamy in the 1844 Doctrine and Covenants right after Joseph died. So what we have is, it's not until 1852 that Section 132 is announced and made public by Brigham Young. And it's published in the Deseret News that year, and then in the Seer in 1853. But it's still not canon. It's just published in the Des News and in the Seer in two publications. But that's when it's first made public. So it's not until 1876 that 132 is finally entered into the Doctrine and Covenants, a year before Brigham's death, and it's the edition that Brigham approved and Orson Pratt compiled. And 132 is included, and it replaces Section 101 from the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants, which is removed. And so the summary in terms of canonical context is that nowhere in the canon until 1876 does Section 132 or a revelation on polygamy, pro-polygamy, supporting polygamy appear. It's only taught in private teachings. and practice. So this begs a question. If it's not in the canon until 1876, why did Joseph Smith never include it in the Doctrine and Covenants? Was it never intended for canon or for the church? Was it only for Emma? That doesn't really make sense, because if 132 is as important to salvation and exaltation as it claims to be, it seems that Joseph Smith would have included it in the canon. So this raises a question: was it created in 1843 or not until 1852? Was it created then? Or was the 1843 version different than the 1852 version? Were there two different versions? One given by Joseph Smith and one later compiled for the D&C by Brigham Young. There are a couple of problems with this. The original of the D&C 132 is non-extant. The copy that Clayton created or took down was supposedly destroyed or burned. Brigham Young said that Emma burned it, which is interesting because burning a revelation suggests a ritual nullification of it as any possible canon. It's very interesting. But Emma said that she didn't burn it and that she had never even seen it until the 1853 publication in the Seer by Orson. So it's quite interesting. All we really have is the Kingsbury copy, which was the version that was published in the Deseret News and in the 1853 Seer, and appears in the 1876 Doctrine and Covenants. There were other copies made as well, but that's the copy that is relied upon. So all of this created some doubt and controversy. Was Joseph Smith really the author of 132, or is it Brigham's text? And also, along with it, did Joseph Smith actually practice polygamy, or was that Brigham's teaching? So this has been an interesting recent controversy. In terms of Joseph Smith practicing polygamy, I would have to say as a historian, yes. I've studied polygamy for many years, written a couple of pieces and have manuscripts on it that I haven't published. In fact, I would refer people to the Dialogue Gospel Study lesson that Andrea Radke Moss and I did on section 132 4 years ago. You can look on the Dialogue site, and it's November 2021 when we taught the lesson on 132, which is an interesting lesson. And today I'm sharing some points I shared from that, along with some other information from my other research. But I would have to say as a historian that yes, Joseph Smith did introduce polygamy, plural relations, plural marriage. He was exploring the concept and the practice in a number of ways, including polyandry. And I think the evidence is overwhelming that he did, because for starters, the canon, Book of Mormon, Jacob 2, and Section 101 texts still show an engagement with polygamy that Joseph is receiving, and theologically. So that's interesting. And then, of course, there are references to Joseph Smith practicing polygamy from 1831 onward, and especially 1842 onward, in sources and letters and witness statements by others. So yes, I think Joseph introduced polygamy and practiced it in some exploratory ways. As for 132, the evidence, is it all Joseph Smith's revelation, or is it all Brigham Young's revelation, or could it be that it's both of them? What I said in the Dialogue Sunday School lesson 4 years ago was that I saw evidence of Brigham's voice or influence in 132. And so my thought at that time in 2021 was that Brigham had influenced Joseph in 1842, which is a really pivotal year for Joseph Smith in the shift between polyandry and polygyny. And also when Brigham Young cites or says that Joseph Smith revealed the concept to him of practicing polygamy, that it was okay to have two wives like Abraham did, that Brigham cites that being told to him by Joseph Smith in 1842. So 1842 is a very important and pivotal year. But back then in 2021, I really thought that 132 was written by Joseph with influence from Brigham Young. Now, what I would say is that I'm torn between the two possibilities of it having been composed fully in 1843 or composed fully in 1852. If it was written in 1843, then I do see Brigham's influence there and voice within 132. If it was written or compiled in 1852 by Brigham and Orson, I would say Joseph Smith's teachings and voice and revelations are in there in that version. So either way, I see both, evidence of both voices. A couple of thoughts about Joseph Smith as the author. If Joseph Smith was the lone author, or evidence that Joseph Smith's voice is in there, it really fits in the historic stage and context of Joseph's polygamy, because 132 comes right between February of 1842, when Joseph shifts from polyandry into polygyny and starts practicing polygyny a lot, and then between the temple endowment in September of 1843, which reveals principles of exaltation and godhood. And 132 foreshadows the temple endowment. It's a very important foreshadowing of principles that are practiced in the temple rites. So 132 fits the stage and context of Joseph's work. And parts of 132 fit Joseph Smith's theology. My favorite part, the one really good part of 132, is verse 19 that says, they shall pass by the angels and the gods, which are set there to their exaltation and glory in all things, as hath been sealed upon their heads, which glory shall be a fullness. Then shall they be gods, because they have no end. Then shall they be above all, because all things are subject unto them. Then shall they be gods, because they have all power, and the angels are subject unto them. So this is canonical gender equality. There is no distinction between the authority of male gods and female gods. They're perfectly equal. And that's a really important concept that is typical of Joseph, particularly when it comes to the temple endowment. It foreshadows the endowment because the endowment conferred the fullness of priesthood upon each individual, men and women, and anointed each one, men and women, for exaltation to become gods. So both men and women got the fullness of the priesthood individually, not based on marriage or being a married couple, because Joseph endowed individuals without a partner into the fullness of the endowment and the priesthood. But so there's an equality that the endowment gave to men and women. And also women were ordained directly to God, not to their husbands. Both men and women were ordained priest and priestess unto the Most High God. So it really foreshadows Joseph's version of the endowment in that one phrase. Clearly, I can see Joseph's voice throughout 132. What's interesting is there's also a focus on Abraham in 132, and that fits Joseph's focus on Abraham in the Book of Abraham, which had just been published the year before in 1842, the year before Section 132 was supposedly received. So, and there are references to, that Joseph makes to Abraham a lot. But some evidence of Joseph Smith not as the sole author, in other words, Brigham Young's voice and theology present in the text, I see a lot of that. For starters, the introduction of 132 cites the patriarchs not in Joseph Smith's previous work. So it says, I, the Lord, justified my servants Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, as also Moses, David, and Solomon, as touching the principle and doctrine of their having many wives and concubines. Joseph doesn't include Isaac or Moses anywhere as polygamous. So that's very odd. It doesn't seem to match Joseph. Also, there are verses in 132 that talk about plural marriage and other verses that don't. The polygamy verses versus the non-polygamy verses. And the polygamy verses are are very commanding that polygamy is necessary for exaltation and Emma will be destroyed if she doesn't obey this principle. But the non-polygamy verses talk about exaltation and eternal marriage, not polygamous marriage. And so you've got two different focuses there. It just seems like they focus on different things. And the polygamy theology doesn't match Joseph Smith's other texts, sermons, teachings, revelations, and the temple rites. The polygamy verses in 132 match Brigham Young's teachings and temple rites, but not Joseph Smith's teachings. The endowment, Joseph gives the endowment to men and to women just 2 months later after 132 in September 1843. And these polygamy sections or verses in 132 really contradict Joseph Smith's version of the temple endowment. But those polygamy verses do match Brigham Young's version of the temple endowment, because in Joseph's temple endowment, men and women are given the very same ordination to the fullness of priesthood, and they're ordained directly to God. In Brigham Young's endowment, he conflates marriage and polygamy into the endowment of priesthood and exaltation, and women are subordinate to men. They're ordained to their husband, and marriage is required for the second endowment. And the endowment, Brigham includes polygamous wives. So really, 132 matches Brigham's endowment, and it doesn't match Joseph Smith's endowment, at least the polygamy sections. And that's what's so interesting. The polygamy sections or verses really match the endowment that Brigham Young brings forth in 1845. But the non-polygamous sections of 132, the verses, match Joseph Smith's endowment that he gives just 2 months later. So I think that's really telling. Also, the polygamy verses, and 132 itself fits a pattern of Brigham Young revising Joseph Smith's teachings and rites and theology and doctrine and organization and history. And so when Brigham announces the 132 in 1852, he needed a doctrinal text to support the public practice and to promote it in Washington, D.C. He sends Orson Pratt to D.C. in December of 1852 to publish a defense of polygamy in the Seer that's aimed at the national government and the national audience. And so Brigham really needs to have a text, a doctrinal text, in order to support this effort. And Brigham basically says that the revelation had been given previously to Joseph Smith, but the doctrine had not been preached by the elders. But he's now ready to proclaim it. And he said, "This revelation has been in my possession many years, but who has known it? None but those who should know it." So there's also precedent, canonical precedent in the D&C for Orson to have compiled Joseph Smith's teachings into new Doctrine and Covenants sections. 132 fits into that pattern. It could fit into that pattern, I should say. Because section 130 and section 131 in the D&C were both compiled by Orson Pratt from Joseph Smith's teachings in 1843, and they're both in the D&C. And 130, like 132, was a new section added to the 1876 D&C by Orson. And also both section 130 and 131 foreshadow the endowment, like section 132. Talking about divine being, the celestial kingdom, exaltation, eternal marriage. And so it's interesting because 130 and 131, the sections just before 132, they foreshadow the non-polygamous verses of 132. They don't foreshadow or seem to match the polygamous verses of section 132. So my conclusion is that there's a real question here. Was 132 created in 1843 or 1852? And when I consider all the evidence pulls both ways. But it all hinges on the Kingsbury transcript of 1843. If the Kingsbury transcript was indeed written in 1843, then that means that 132 was composed in 1843. I think that we need deeper work on the transcripts and on the rhetorical analysis of 132, especially compared to the rhetoric of Joseph Smith and Brigham Young and their scribes and others. Many people are working on this. I've worked on it for years. I'm confident more information will come to light, but whether 132 was composed fully in 1843 or in 1852, I do see Brigham's voice and views and rhetoric and theology within that text, which has to be explained one way or the other. That either he influenced Joseph Smith in 1842 and 43, or he used Joseph Smith's teachings to compile it in 1852. Ultimately, I have to say 132, like all scripture, whether Mormon or biblical or apocryphal, is not simply or all the voice of God. It's the voice of humans sharing glimpses and moments of their encounter with God or divine mind. So scripture is mostly human. No scripture is God's pure word. All scripture contains human beliefs, biases, errors, and we have to look for the divine glimpses, or as Joseph Smith said, that we have to discern what's true in any scripture. And so I would say 132 is not all divine or incumbent upon us. We have to read and discern the truths within 132 apart from, I would say, the untruths or the human biased flawed parts. Last thing I would say is my suggestion about 132 as a feminist theologian and a historian. What do I suggest? I think the church could revoke it because as canon it was given so late in 1876 and it refutes the previous canon. And there are questions about the original copy. So the church could simply revoke 132. Another idea, which would be my preference, I think, would be to keep the 132 but remove the polygamy verses and keep the non-polygamy verses, especially about the equality of gods. Since polygamy was revoked by the church in 1890 and it's been considered apostate since 1904. Last, it would be quite a job to try to determine which passages reflect Joseph Smith's theology and which passages reflect Brigham's in terms of a rhetorical analysis. That's a much longer project. So I think the simple version would be to simply divide the polygamy from the non-polygamy verses. Thank you.